June 2017, and I decided to take a quick trip to the Basque country. The giant juvenile canine friend behind me is a temporary exhibition placed outside the Guggenheim that looks like it may well become permanent. I won't lie, it was seeing pictures of the Guggenheim that made me pick Bilbao as the list of destinations when I was looking at a holiday flight sales back in December for air trips around Europe. It really is quite something. That's titanium on the outside, which catches the light in different ways at different times of the day, and it cost something like 100 million to build, 100 million paid for by the Bilbao City Council. The construction of the Guggenheim is often credited for the so-called regeneration of Bilbao. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, Bilbao used to be a steel and iron town. But due to a mixture of over-extraction of the ores and neoliberal opening up of Spain after the death of Franco, the steel industry went into decline. There's very little existing now. The Guggenheim is actually built on the site of one of the old industrial zones that was in a state of dereliction and, of course, pollution, and had to be cleaned up at the council's expense in order to build the museum here. At the time, I think in radical circles there was quite a debate over how legitimate the enormous spend for this was and whether or not it would actually work. From what I could see, there was certainly a fair bit of tourism around Bilbao, and from reading accounts of the way it was, that certainly wouldn't have been the case a couple of decades back. But the problem with tourism is it tends to provide a very particular type of employment, which is precarious and very often low paid at the minimum wage or below. And in a lot of cities where you have tourism becoming the major factor, the other thing, of course, that's happened is it forces out the local population because both real estate in terms of space and also housing gets increasingly turned over to tourism. In recent years, of course, this has become a really big issue with Airbnb. And I saw figures, in fact, when I was away that suggested that in Dublin there are now something like 3,500 Airbnb rentals that are rented on a permanent basis. In other words, this isn't somebody, renting out a spare room. This is a landlord who's bought a house, probably evicted the existing tenants, and is then renting it out on a short-term basis because there's more money in that. Now, given the huge housing crisis in Dublin, you can see what a problem it is that something like 3,500 units have been removed from the rental pool. One of the other aspects that makes central Bilbao attractive to tourists is the huge profusion of really fancy, elaborate, and had to be expensive old stone buildings. Now, last year when I was in Lisbon, what very much came home in Lisbon was the extent to which these sort of structures are products of colonialism, the products of the period where particular European countries went out and looted both the Americas and the Middle East and Asian spice trades, looted temples, took silver and gold, and were able to afford to build all sorts of elaborate structures back home, but at the enormous cost of millions of lives. I'm not sure if the same sort of thing is happening in Bilbao. It could be. I think the Basques were very involved in a lot of the Spanish conquistador exhibitions, and presumably that meant at least some of that rent was coming back. But a lot of it is probably also connected up with the steel industry. For a very, very long time, steel was being exported. Steel and iron were exported from the Basque region to other places in Europe. So a lot of old medieval swords, for instance, will be made with steel that came from the Basque country. So there was an enormous internal source of wealth that was also being exported, and perhaps that's part of the story here as well. Probably part of the reason Basques played such a significant part in the Spanish conquests was that they had developed quite a strong naval tradition. Possibly that was partially to do with the export of iron early on, but by quite early in modern history they were harvesting huge amounts of salt cod. In fact, it's thought they may have found Newfoundland quite early on, and then later on engaged in whale hunting, which lasted up until the 1850s, when they lost access to whales off Newfoundland, and also they outfished or overfished the Bay of Biscay, so there were no whales left there. I didn't get to go into the Guggenheim. It's closed Mondays, and I was there Sunday evening and Monday. I did get to go to the Fine Arts Museum, which is nearby. That does open Mondays, and it's got a pretty stupendous collection actually. It's well worth visiting if you are nearby. It's got a lot of kind of very impressive Flemish work, because of course that area of Europe was under control of Spain at the time, which very much reflects a lot of the class prejudices at the time as well, so it's kind of interesting from that point of view. But perhaps the most bizarre stuff is the collection of what I would call medieval Christian gore art, mostly from the 1450s, which is this incredibly lifelike, well painted stuff that depicts various horrendous scenes. And I guess was a very powerful thing the church had back in the 1450s, when most people couldn't read, and so this was the way you had religion explained to you, by looking at the sort of stuff that's going on in these particular paintings. These are also the period of the Reconquest, when the Moors and Jews were expelled from Spain. In the aftermath of that, you had the Inquisition, which sought out to root out heresy, and in the Basque region in the 1600s, something like 1,600 women were put on trial for witchcraft, with at least half that number being burnt at the stake as a result. The museum also has quite an interesting collection of Basque sort of cultural documentary style painting, which is interesting because it has some similarities, I think, with the Irish nationalist paintings of the 1800s as well, which was setting out to do something similar, which is sort of rescue an image of peasants' life as it was seen. But it's also got an interesting collection of much more kind of realistic paintings from the 18 and 1900s that again portray society also in a way that brings out some of the class divisions in that society. And of course it also has some nudes. What's a museum without nudes? Inevitably, coming from Ireland and being a political activist of the left, one of the things you're most aware of in relation to the Basque country is the national struggle here and what interrelationship that has with Ireland, which proved impossible to talk about in Bilbao airport without getting paranoid about who was overhearing me. So I ended up taking a break here and starting recording again back in Ireland, which, as it happens, segues us perfectly into my footage of the Basque Cultural Museum in Bilbao. So initially this is a rather pretty piece of stonework, but in fact it records a rather grim moment in history. It was erected after the crushing of a proto-communist Christian heresy in the town of Durango in the Basque country, and under this heresy led by a friar called Alfonso de Mela, they believed, among other things, that property should be held in common. That sort of heresy popped up again and again, in fact, in Europe in the kind of Middle Ages. They were crushed, and many of the followers of Mela were burnt at the stake, some of them managing to escape.
On the other hand, the sequence you're looking at now is the top floor of the museum, where they've preserved the old and rather grand consulate that used to exist up here, and it was a demonstration perhaps of how the other side of that society used to live. Although only a couple of exhibits are labelled in English, the museum is actually well worth a visit because a lot of it is fairly pictorial and graphical, so you can sort of work out what's going on just from looking at it. And one of the most interesting things is the role of iron and steel in the Basque country. From a very early period, they were making Europe's swords, and this is a very early blast furnace for producing steel, a diagram of another second one. So, I mean, these are some sort of 11, 1200s. Early iron and steel industry, just really cottage industry, was protected under the traditional laws known as the fueros. But later on in the capitalist period, iron ore and steel production was exploited to a considerable extent, resulting in the exhaustion of most of the actual deposits, really within a very short period of time. And that made a limited number of Basque merchants extremely wealthy. But of course has removed that resource entirely from that society. So it's kind of an interesting story in microcosm of how capitalism works. The figure at the centre of the court here is an Iron Age, probably 1st to 5th century BC idol that shows a pig or a boar holding a disc, which is probably the sun under its legs. The central courtyard area contains a number of old wall sculptures and things like that. Just outside the museum, I spotted this shop with the anarchist graffiti on it. It's the museum's in the old town, which is a sequence of narrow streets with kind of high buildings. You understand the functionality of that when you're there on a hot day, because it preserves a fair amount of coolness and also a bit of wind that blows between them. I spent a couple of days wandering around Bilbao. I must say I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and I reckon you could probably actually spend quite a bit more. There's a number of excursions you could go on close by, including down to the coast where the river opens up. But I was on a short trip, so the next thing I did was I headed over to San Sebastian, or Donostia as it's called. Donostia also means San Sebastian, but in Basque. And this is a spectacular town. It's basically two bays with beautiful beaches in each bay, and a small island in front of one of the bays, and then the town looks mostly out on that small island. I was there partially for the summer solstice. I've developed a bit of a tradition of trying to go somewhere interesting every year for the summer solstice. So one of the things I did was I climbed the hill where the old town is located, and from the top of the hill I watched the sun set on the eve of the solstice. Technically the solstice runs from the evening of the previous day through the day of the solstice itself to that evening. And this is the sun setting on the summer solstice, running at, I think, probably double speed, so you don't have to watch it for ages, and at maximum magnification. It's quite a gathering spot. If you're there, there's a small fort, and you can sort of walk around to the corner of the fort, which gives you this great view out over the bay to where the sun is setting in these shots. I went up there for a couple of sunsets, and it's actually quite a party point. Both times there were different groups of probably 30 or so people in the 20s maybe, who got to watch the sunset, drink, and on the second day actually doing quite a bit of dancing as well. There's a sign on the wall as you go through. There's a fortification wall you go through that tells you the park shuts at 9:30. So I was a little bit worried the first time I went up there in case I'd ended up being trapped for the night. But I decided the solstice necessitated the risk taking. But in fact, no, they don't lock the gate, or at least they weren't locking it those nights at 9:30, so I could get out again. Again, these are some views from up there, and both the solstice and the following night, really spectacular. I really, really strongly recommend that visit. Basque nationalism is very much more visible to Donostia than it is in Bilbao. You see on apartments, you'd quite a few places were hanging out the sort of black map of Escarada. And I have the impression that probably when the guerrilla struggle was on, it was a place not so many people were going to. It's now, because it's so beautiful, it's now become very touristy, and I would suspect that's going to lead to displacement of the local population almost completely from the old town over the next few years. As it is, it's one end of it is almost completely tourist. A couple of the streets running through it are completely tourist, and then there's a couple of areas that are a bit less touristy, but that's very much a sort of thing in progress. So if you wanted to go, you probably want to go sooner rather than later. I also suspect that means prices are going to go soaring. When I was there, it was pretty affordable, certainly to be as a kind of standard tourist thing, but I suspect it's already the case that locals are being priced out, and I certainly know from a conversation I had with one of the shopkeepers that it's seeing the same problem with Airbnb that we're seeing in many kind of popular tourist cities around the globe. Apparently there in particular, what's happening is it's become very difficult to rent a lot of apartments from June to October. You can only get these 8 or 9 month rentals, and then you have to get out for June to October because the owner of the building will then be renting it out short term to tourists and making a lot more money out of it than they would renting to locals. It's interesting this because I've reflected on this on my last couple of trips, that there's an effect of mass tourism where it completely destroys what makes people actually want to go and visit places. Quite often, I was on a trip to Crete quite recently to the one of the things that's in the tourist book is going to the market in Hania, which I'm sure used to be a very interesting space, but nowadays it consists almost entirely of stalls that sell various tourist trinkets as souvenirs. And you know, the sense of what was probably an old meat, fish and vegetable market and quite an interesting space because of that has almost gone completely.
Saying all that, of course, I'm completely aware of the irony of talking about the dangers of tourism while being a tourist myself. I don't think it's an irresolvable contradiction. I think the problem essentially is that under capitalism, when everything happens for profit, particularly in areas of the world that are a bit lower income, tourism is always going to have the effect of displacing the local population and in extreme cases taking over water supplies and all that sort of stuff. I think in a world where people's housing and things like that were actually provided by society as a thing that happens, well then you're not going to see the same sort of pressures by tourism because it's then only able to occupy the secondary spaces rather than, you know, because it's about cash, being able to occupy the primary space in society and displace everybody else. Is that a solution? I think it probably is. I certainly think it's probably a better solution than, you know, some sort of idea that we can actually stop people travelling, because in practice that always translates into stopping poorer people travelling and people who've got more money, wealth and access to travel then feeling that places are unspoiled because they're there but those other people aren't.
Indeed, if we're completely honest, on the planet we live at the moment, the reality behind tourism is pretty grim. Probably half the population of this planet never really get to be a tourist. Maybe they get to travel relatively short distances for family events like weddings or baptisms or whatever. And then, of course, a significant subfraction of that, 50%, travel longer distances, but that's completely imposed on them by economy and by warfare. I'm thinking in particular of the waves of desperate emigration into Europe we've seen over the last few years, thanks to the wars in Iraq and in Syria and Afghanistan, but also the poverty that European colonialism continues to impose on the European periphery. I mean, it's hard to think of anything more desperate than the plight of the people trying to cross the Mediterranean, and, you know, thousands, at this stage it's running into tens of thousands of people drowning while doing so, while at the same time I can go as a tourist to Turkey, to Izmir for instance, and I can get a ferry costing a couple of quid that covers the same distance and goes to between the same places that somebody might be paying €1,000 to have somebody smuggle them across and be at significant risk to the life of both them and their family. Well, so perhaps now I'm doing your head in and you're sort of feeling like, I should never travel. But I think the thing is, that's no answer at all. I mean, the reality is that you or me or anybody else staying at home isn't going to make this world one jot a fairer place at all. It won't have any sort of impact. It's not an individual problem. There isn't some sort of individual solution to this. It's a collective issue. And I think that, yes, being able to travel is an enormous privilege and needs to be recognised as such. It's not some sort of incidental thing. You're getting something that lots of other people don't get. So really, if you want to do something about that, the other side of that is actually joining the fight to make the planet a fairer place. And sometimes you can also use your travel to do that. You can check out what's happening locally. Perhaps there are ways you can show solidarity with struggles that are happening locally. But mostly I think it's a question of when you get back home, about involving yourself in social struggles, looking at the state of the world the way it is, and actually looking for the places that you can fight to make that different, where you can fight to make a change. One particularly famous aspect of tourism in the Basque Country is the food. In fact, that's connected, of course, to the role of Basques in Spanish colonialism, because that meant they travelled all around the world, so that there was food from all over the place being brought back. And you have quite early adoption of chilies and other spices, for instance. But certainly today, if you're visiting, the food's great. What are called tapas elsewhere in Spain are Pintxos in Basque. I think I'm pronouncing that correct. Salt cod, which is this one here, being the kind of local speciality. I'm not sure about that. It was invented during a siege of Bilbao when there was nothing to eat except salt cod, mild chilies and olive oil. So they did what they could with that, but from my reckoning, it's really more of the sort of food you save up for when you've a hangover or indeed a siege that you're being subjected to. Another contradiction of tourism, of course, is that often the beautiful place you're in right now had a grim history in the not-so-distant past. I noticed, for instance, in the town hall, there's a whole load of either bullet or shrapnel marks in the frontage of it. Possibly bullets, because they do appear to be grouped around the windows. But you wonder what particularly grim spell of history that came from. Was that the Civil War? Was it maybe a car bomb there in the 1980s? Who really knows? Well, I guess if you're living locally there, you know. But as a tourist, you just sort of see these clues and you're not really sure what they're telling you. And of course, it very much involved in trying to repress certain aspects of the Basque movement as a result. One of the things I came across was, I think they're called people's houses, which are bars, restauranty places, and social centres, which are under threat of eviction from the Spanish state. There's about 100 of them scattered around the Basque country, and the Spanish state presents them as being part of the ETA infrastructure. They deny that. They see themselves more as community spaces, but also spaces that exist to help support the people who are still prisoners of the Spanish state as a result of the repression of the Basques earlier in the period, and of course of ETA itself. This monument's to the women who rebuilt Donostia after the British Empire burnt it down in 1813, despite supposedly being on the same site. And this is rather nice. It's the last woman who carried out the traditional practice of selling sardines off a wooden board. That was once the way that most people would have got fresh fish if they were a bit removed from the coastline. This is a memorial to the 400 local people executed in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War in the Basque Country. In San Sebastian specifically. There was about 16,000 to 26,000 killed in the Basque Country. That's in executions, and I think extrajudicial executions from the outbreak of the Civil War up to 1947. These are a apparently famous sculpture which looked to me like euros, rusty euros at one side of the bay. I think they probably look a lot better when the tide is in, and I just happened to be there when the tide was out.
A final few glimpses of what has to be one of the most photographic and beautiful bays of any city in the world. And I've seen a few at this stage. I hope you've enjoyed these segments of my holiday and my ramblings as I think about some of the issues that going away always brings up in my mind. I definitely found the Basque Country very much worth a visit. And I think we'll end with the final look at that Iron Age idol, so 5th century or so.